A potential U.S. military action to overthrow the regime of dictator Nicolas Maduro would eradicate one of the greatest threats to U.S. national well-being and security. As the heir to neo-communist dictator Hugo Chavez and himself a former militant of a far-left party in his early youth, even receiving training as a terrorist guerrilla in communist Cuba, Maduro has always been known for his hatred of the United States, expressed in his incendiary rhetoric and above all in his actions. As Chavez's foreign minister for many years, Maduro was instrumental in negotiating the Venezuelan regime's alliances with virtually all of the U.S.'s enemies around the world, and in sponsoring international terrorism. As President Maduro has intensified alliances with China, Russia, Cuba, and most dangerously with the Islamist regime of Iran and Iran's proxy terrorist groups, especially Hezbollah. Under Chavez, and later Maduro, Venezuela has become a gigantic operational base for Hezbollah, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Quds Force, Iran's most powerful and lethal elite forces. The existence of bases for these Islamist organizations in a country that, at its closest point, is 172 miles from the United States, almost the same distance between Chicago and Miami, is undoubtedly a serious threat to U.S. national security. Venezuela also hosts military forces from the communist regime of Cuba and Russian military advisors. The Venezuelan regime has offered to host Russian naval bases and has handed over the exploitation of strategic mineral resources on its territory to Russian and Chinese companies. But the greatest weapon the Venezuelan regime uses to harm the United States is undoubtedly drug trafficking. Since Chavez came to power more than 26 years ago, the Venezuelan dictatorship has been involved in the drug trafficking business. Chavez wanted to help the Colombian communist guerrillas in their fight against the democratic governments of Colombia, and so he ordered the Venezuelan military to assist the Colombian guerrillas in the drug trafficking operations they carried out to finance their insurgent campaigns and to allow the use of Venezuelan territory for this illegal trade. However, Chavez also shared the vision of Colombian and Cuban communists of using drugs to corrupt American society and destabilize the United States. But Chavez also quickly discovered that the drug business could serve to consolidate his power within Venezuela, using it to buy off high-ranking Venezuelan military officials. By allowing Venezuelan military officials to become major drug traffickers and using the entire structure of the Venezuelan armed forces to traffic drugs, he ensured that the military would repress the Venezuelan people with violence and terror to maintain the leftist dictatorship in power. This was the birth of the Cartel of the Suns, a drug cartel formed by the Venezuelan government and armed forces. The bosses of this cartel are all members of the regime's political leadership, as well as the most important Venezuelan generals and admirals, who have amassed fortunes in the billions of dollars and enjoy the same luxuries as Russian oligarchs or Arab sheiks. In fact, the cartel's operational leader is the second most important person in the regime, Diosdado Cabello, who is one of the richest criminals in the world. According to some sources, up to 25% of the drugs entering the United States of America pass through Venezuelan territory. This is because the Venezuelan government and its military have effectively become a gigantic drug cartel, using all Venezuelan government resources to develop drug trafficking operations. What's more, the Venezuelan regime offers the services of the entire Venezuelan economy, including its financial system, to launder money for all the drug cartels around the world, turning Venezuela into the largest global financial center for international drug trafficking. Obviously, overthrowing the cartel that rules Venezuela would be a severe blow to the global drug trafficking industry. But what would be the real scenario the U.S. would face if it intervened militarily in Venezuela to overthrow the narco-dictatorship? First, let's discuss the size and circumstances of Venezuela, the enemy country of the United States we're discussing today. Venezuela has a territory of 353,841 square miles, 916,445 square kilometers, almost 32% larger than Texas, the second largest state in the Union. Venezuela's population is between 26.5 and 30.5 million, slightly less than that of Texas, the second most populous state in the Union. However, 85% of the Venezuelan population is concentrated in the northernmost coastal strip of Venezuela, which represents 15% of the country's territory. Furthermore, between 50% and 55% of the population is concentrated in the center of that coastal strip, a region that represents less than 5% of the territory. For this same reason, the Venezuelan armed forces concentrate at least 70% of their resources and personnel in this northern coastal strip of the country, a territory slightly smaller than Arkansas, and obviously this makes it easier to concentrate attack operations in a relatively small territory, especially bombings of strategic targets. In the event of an invasion, the country's most valuable and populated territories are very close to potential beachheads for amphibious operations. For example, the country's capital, Caracas, a city of nearly 5 million inhabitants, is located, as the crow flies, between 9.3 and 12.4 miles from the coast, or 16.16 miles along the highway that connects the city to the coast, crossing a mountain range that is 9,140 feet high at its highest point. Furthermore, at that point, on the coast near the capital, there's a huge port, the port of La Guaira, and also a large international airport, the Simón Bolívar Maiquetía International Airport. Once captured and secured, these can easily be used for the landing of a large assault force. Furthermore, within the city of Caracas itself, there is an airfield popularly known as La Carlota, which is a Venezuelan military aviation base. It is large enough to allow troop transport aircraft to land. Therefore, if it were occupied and secured by airborne troops, it would allow troops to be delivered quickly to the heart of the city. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces of Venezuela, including all its branches, Army, Air Force, Navy, and National Guard, have between 100,000 and 300,000 personnel. The soldiers and sailors are young men serving their mandatory military service. The equipment and weapons of the Venezuelan military are a mix of US-made and other Western equipment manufactured in the 1970s and 1980s, and therefore outdated, and Russian-made equipment sold in the 2000s, which is second or third-rate surplus from post-Soviet Russian arsenals. All equipment is in poor condition due to a lack of maintenance and repair, leaving the Venezuelan armed forces very outdated and poorly armed. All analysts' estimates agree that the poor condition of Venezuelan arsenals places them at a terrible disadvantage compared to U.S. troops. The deficiencies are particularly serious in the Venezuelan Navy's fleet of vessels and Venezuelan Air Force aircraft, and the Venezuelan Army's tanks and other armored vehicles. Air and sea dominance would be relatively easy for the U.S. Regarding troop morale, the situation is not good for the Venezuelan regime. The salaries of the vast majority of Venezuelan military personnel are ridiculously low, so much so that they are condemned to poverty and are unable to support their families. Furthermore, living conditions in the barracks are subhuman, especially regarding food, which they describe as dog food. Added to this is the unrest caused by the constant spying and intimidation by military intelligence, which acts as political commissars to suppress any hint of rebellion. And of course, there is the total lack of commitment to a regime that is highly unpopular in the country and practically no longer has an ideology or political vision, and the degradation and death of the military spirit in an armed forces that has become a mere enforcement arm of a drug cartel, as if it were a totally corrupt police department in a movie. All of this is the reason why hundreds of Venezuelan soldiers desert the armed forces every year, and many of them prefer to become illegal immigrants in other countries working in any job. This suggests that in the event of a serious confrontation with U.S. forces, the Venezuelan armed forces would quickly collapse and its troops would disband. As for the regime's other paramilitary forces, the Bolivarian National Militia, which Venezuelan regime propaganda claims is made up of hundreds of thousands of civilians trained to take up arms as an army reserve, actually consists of only a few thousand people who, due to the poverty in which they live, are forced to participate in supposed paramilitary exercises for a few dollars. This explains why, as can be seen in the videos of these theatrical exercises, most of the militia members are elderly, homeless, people with addictions, or single mothers, and many use antique weapons. The militia is far more inefficient and useless than the regular army, and in the event of a conflict, most of its members are expected never even to fight. The only regime force that could cause problems is the so-called colectivos, gangs of ghetto gangsters who work for the regime in exchange for money and power, usually serving as thugs to terrorize the civilian population. The colectivos mobsters are armed with weapons of war and have more determination and will to fight than the military. In this regard, we must not forget the Tren de Aragua, Venezuela's most notorious criminal gang, which is an associate of the Cartel of the Suns, that is, of the Venezuelan regime. The Tren de Aragua, which already has a significant presence in the United States and other countries, could mobilize its hundreds of gunmen in Venezuela to defend the regime. Regarding the general population of Venezuela, in last year's presidential election, between 80 and 90% of Venezuelans would have voted against dictator Maduro, according to extensive evidence gathered by opposition and independent sources, even though Maduro and his associates carried out electoral fraud and stole the election, claiming Maduro's re-election as president. The vast majority of Venezuelans in principle would welcome a U.S. intervention to overthrow Maduro. It is quite possible that the United States would not need a full-scale invasion of Venezuela to overthrow the Maduro regime and his Cartel of the Suns. Rather, bombings of strategic targets and limited ground operations by elite U.S. units would suffice to cause a collapse of the Venezuelan armed forces, prompting a large portion of Venezuelan generals and admirals to switch sides and rebel against Maduro, agreeing to collaborate with the United States to survive. In that scenario, the United States would not need to occupy the country as it did in Iraq, and could use the Venezuelan military itself to maintain order and combat an unlikely, though not ruled out, insurgency by supporters of the